Right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you for coming today. Um, as Paul said, the story I'm going to tell today is about World War One. And while World War One may not be very prominently on the radar screen in Sweden, or indeed in my own country and the Netherlands, because these countries were neutral during World War One, it is, of course, something that is very widely remembered across Europe, with countless lectures like these, but also conferences, commemorative volumes. You can go into any bookshop in Austria, Germany, or France, and it will have special displays on World War One at the moment. So, what is there to add? Well, what I want to do is to look at World War One in the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, because we can, of course, look on this immense historical phenomenon of World War One on entirely different levels. We can look at the global war, and there's no doubt at all that it was a global conflict. If you look at the Middle East, for instance, and see who's fighting there, you get a very good sense of this global nature of the conflict. In the Middle East, Englishmen, Scotsmen, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Frenchmen, French Africans, Russians, Cossacks, Ukrainians, Georgians fought, Arabs and Armenians, and Armenians and Arabs fought Prussians, Bavarians, Austrians, Turks, Kurds, Circassians, and other Arabs. A very global conflict, drawing in people from all over the world. On the other extreme, you can look at it in a local context. The war had a very strong local or regional character as well. The war in Flanders fields, was very similar for soldiers, whether they were on the British or Belgian side or on the German side. But it was very different from the fighting, for instance, on the Somme, more to the south, or of the Austrians and the Italians in the Alps, or even from the war experienced by the French and German soldiers in the Alsace. In terms of logistics, equipment, intensity, food, health, the Mesopotamian front in Iraq was completely different from that of Gallipoli. But between the global and the local is the level of the single state. And this is primarily what I would like to occupy us with for the next 40 minutes or so. The question I should like to ask is this: in which respects did the Ottoman War experience differ substantially from the experience of other countries, other belligerent states in Europe? And my argument will be that indeed the way the people of the Ottoman Empire experienced the war did differ significantly from the experience in Europe. And the differences, I think, can be summed up under 5 headings. First, the outbreak of war, then the nature of the war, total or industrial warfare, the effects of the war on the population, the end, and the political legacy of the war. All of these were very different in the Ottoman context, I would say. First, let's look at the outbreak of war. The way the outbreak of World War I is remembered, in fact has been remembered since 1918 in Europe, is primarily as the very sudden and ultimately traumatic end to a golden age, a summer that suddenly turned into winter. The crumbling of Barbara Tuchman's Edwardian Proud Tower. After all, Lord Grey, the British Foreign Minister, famously said in August 1914, "The lamps are going out all over Europe, and we will not see them lit again in our lifetime." And that saying has become so famous because it summarized the feeling of a generation. It retrospectively defined the experience of August 1914. The outbreak of war is seen as sudden, unexpected, unprecedented, and on the individual level as life-changing. This view goes back, of course, to the actual experience of those who took part, particularly the officers. Although great power rivalry had created a climate of almost continuous tension in Europe before 1914, very few people expected a general European war. When it broke out, ending a period of over 40 years of peace in Europe, even fewer people expected it to last for more than 3 or 4 months. The reality of a long drawn-out conflict fought in the trenches therefore came as a great shock. This is reflected in all of the memorable works of literature that came out of the war, from Sassoon to Graves to Céline, Hemingway and Remarque. The image of the sharp contrast is persistent and also informs a relatively recent novel like Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. This memory contrasts sharply with the way the proclamation of war was actually experienced in Europe in July-August 1914. And that is the famous spirit of 1914, or otherwise war enthusiasm. And for a long time, the idea that this war enthusiasm was universal dominated historiography. Since the 1990s, however, quite a good deal of revisionist historical research has been done that substantially altered this picture of universal joy and relief that war finally broke out. Now that the dust has settled over the historical debate, the new consensus seems to be that the war enthusiasm was largely an urban middle-class phenomenon, and that its strength has been overrated because of the strength of nationalist propaganda, but that it was nevertheless a reality in August 1914. There is, after all, ample pictorial evidence, both in photographs and on film, that war was celebrated by masses of people in the capitals of Europe. Neither the later perception of the sudden ending of a golden age, nor the contemporary one of war enthusiasm is relevant to an understanding of the Ottoman Empire's experience of the outbreak of war. It was completely different. For the Ottomans, the outbreak of war in 1914 was experienced in the first place as yet another war. It came hard upon the heels of a series of small but bloody conflicts in places like the Yemen, Albania, Crete, and 2 major wars, one with Italy in 1911-1912 and the Balkan Wars in 1912-1913. The Italian War had led to the loss of the empire's African possessions, contemporary Libya, and ultimately also to the loss of the Dodecanese Islands, places like Rhodes and Kos. That was a serious setback, but in no way can be compared to the traumatic effect of the Balkan War. The outcome of the Balkan War that broke out in October 1912 was a tremendous shock for the Ottoman Muslim population. Of course, nationalist agitation supported by Bulgaria, Greece and Serbia had been going on for decades, and in fact the threat that the Ottomans might lose Macedonia had been the strongest motivation for the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. The Ottoman army was continuously engaged in counterinsurgency operations sanctioned by the 1909 law against brigandage, and the idea that this situation might lead to war with the neighboring states like Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria was not, of course, far-fetched. But any such conflict was seen in terms of one between an empire, the Ottoman, and a couple of small states. Just before the Balkan War broke out, optimism reigned. There was great confidence in the army that had been reformed with German help in the preceding years. The military maneuvers and parades of 1911 and 1912 had gone rather well and had been reported on favorably also by European observers. And when war was declared, a famous cartoon in the Ottoman press of the day showed Nazim Pasha, the Ottoman war minister, ordering tickets to Sofia, Belgrade, Athens, and Cetinje at a railway ticket office. And when asked whether he's traveling alone, he says, "No, I'm bringing 800,000 friends." The Ottoman army, of course. It was therefore a tremendous shock when the Ottoman armies were defeated within a month. And all of European Turkey was lost, with the exception of a few fortified towns. When the war finally ended with the Treaty of Constantinople in September 1913, the Ottomans had lost the vast majority of their European possessions. This was particularly traumatic for three reasons. Firstly, the lost territories had been a core area of the empire since the 15th century. They had been Ottoman for much longer than most of Anatolia. Secondly, the majority of the political, military, and cultural elite hailed from this area. And thirdly, the conquest of European Turkey caused up to 400,000 Muslims from the area to become refugees. After the peace treaty, differences between the Ottoman Empire and Greece over the possession of the Aegean islands adjacent to the Anatolian coast, places like Lemnos and Lesbos and Chios, persisted, and there was widespread fear that war might recommence. So, where for most of Europe war was something that had not been experienced in more than a generation, in the Ottoman Empire it was already a reality. The Balkan Wars had directly confronted the Ottoman public with the hardships of war, mobilization, defeat, but also hunger, a cholera epidemic, and masses of displaced persons. In the spring of 1914, as Mustafa Aksakal has shown, the expectation that war might resume between Greece and the empire was still widespread. When World War I came, it was therefore the third war in quick succession. For the Ottomans, therefore, the outbreak of war in 1914 could not be seen retrospectively as a sudden end to a glorious summer, and the war-peace dichotomy that characterizes the Great War in European modern memory could never work. Neither was the spirit of 1914 much in evidence. With two military defeats in quick succession behind it, there was no perceptible war enthusiasm in the Ottoman Empire. The urban population expressed a genuine patriotic feeling on two occasions in 1914. The first one was when the British government impounded two battleships that were being built for the Ottomans on British yards. This was a very sensitive issue because part of the cost of the battleships had been covered by voluntary contributions from the Ottoman public, which therefore had followed the construction of the warships with great interest in the press, for instance. The ships were urgently needed to counterbalance the dominance of the Greek navy that had been demonstrated in the Balkan War. So the British decision early in August to impound these ships and add them to the Royal Navy gave rise to widespread anger and demonstrations. The decision by the Ottoman government in September to abolish unilaterally the 350-year-old system of capitulations, which granted fiscal and legal privileges to foreigners, foreign subjects resident in the empire, and which by the early 20th century had created a semi-colonial situation in the empire, that was also greeted with genuine and spontaneous joy on the part of the Muslim population in the Ottoman cities. And this was in sharp contrast with public reaction to the declaration of war and even to the declaration of jihad at the end of October 1914, when the Ottomans actually joined the war. Public demonstrations in favor of the war took place, but as Mehmet Beşikçi has shown, these were all organized by the Committee of Union and Progress, the people in power at the time, and its affiliated organizations. Attendance was small, and in some cases, street vendors, porters, and beggars were actually paid to take part in these demonstrations. So the Ottoman population knew no war enthusiasm in 1914. It just accepted the inevitable. Let us then look at the nature of the war itself. There is some debate whether World War I was actually the first industrial war, in the sense that it was waged with industrial means and that industrial production capacity ultimately decided the outcome. Some give this doubtful honor to the American Civil War, which is 50 years earlier. But however that may be, there can be no doubt that World War I was indeed a war that was waged with industrial means. Whether we look at arms production, the need to feed and clothe the troops, the provision of medical supplies, or transport needs of the armies of millions, all of this demanded the involvement of industry. Industrial development in the Ottoman Empire, however, was still minimal. And we can therefore characterize the empire as an agricultural society engaged in an industrial war. And that posed fundamental problems. A few statistics make this abundantly clear. Industry in 1914 was, of course, still largely dependent on coal as an energy source. Now let's look at the coal production of the belligerents in the early 20th century. The numbers for 1900 tell their own story. Coal production of the United Kingdom was 381 times that of the Ottoman Empire. In other words, the yearly coal production of the Ottoman Empire is produced in Great Britain in less than a day. Russia's coal production is much smaller, but still 27 times as big as Ottoman coal production. There was no steel production on an industrial scale in the Ottoman Empire at all. The result of the lack of industrialization was that almost all armaments, and certainly all railway engines, trucks, cars, artillery guns, shells, airplanes, wireless equipment, had to be imported from Germany and Austria. Rail transport thus was crucial, both for moving the troops and for supplying them. Here too the Ottoman Empire was at a great disadvantage. The United Kingdom had 5.6 times the railway mileage of the Ottoman Empire, in spite of having a surface area 20 times smaller. Russia had a railway network 11 times the size of the Ottoman Empire. And in terms of density, that's to say kilometers of railway per square kilometer of surface, even colonial India had 5 times the density of the Ottoman Empire. In addition, all of the Ottoman rail network was single track. Some crucial passages like the Taurus tunnels had not yet been completed, and part of the network was narrow gauge. The result was that all material coming from Germany or Austria had to be loaded and unloaded a total of 8 times, or rather 16 times, if you count the unloading and the loading, before it finally reached the Palestine front, for instance. Lack of transport also meant that it was very difficult to feed the troops and, of course, the population in general. Syria and Lebanon went through the worst famine in their history, while Anatolia actually had a wheat surplus during the war. Well, it's of course also true that Austro-Hungary and Russia lagged far behind France, Britain, and the United States and Germany in terms of industrialization. The situation of the Ottoman Empire in this respect was incomparable. Where its main enemies, France, Britain, and Russia combined, accounted for 26% of world industrial output, the Ottoman Empire accounted for under 1%. So, industrial warfare from the start was a game the empire was very ill-positioned to play. Now, next to the term industrial war, the term total war is also often used to describe World War I. And the concept of total war, involving the mobilization of all human and material resources of a country for war, was popularized by German General Colmar von der Goltz in his 1883 book, Das Volk in Waffen, The Nation in Arms. A huge hit, a tremendous success, read by military officers all over the world, translated into many languages. And in that book, he basically denies the fundamental difference between the army and civilians in a war. Apart from a huge logistical and administrative effort, waging total war, in his view, also necessitated an effective and pervasive educational and propaganda effort to involve and motivate society as a whole. Germany, France, and Britain were very effective at this by making use of the press, posters, photography, film. Actually, the invention of the term the home front by the British government was itself a propagandist masterpiece. The home front is not, the term has actually been invented. It's part of the propaganda effort to create the image, the idea that yes, our boys are at the front, but we are also waging war with different means. It is perhaps the ultimate vindication of von der Goltz's ideas on total war. And as Errol Kurulu has shown, the Ottoman Empire, with an illiteracy of over 90%, was not able to sustain such a propaganda effort. The use of religion, of Islam, to mobilize the population could compensate for this to a certain extent, but not enough. So in terms of industrial and total warfare, the experience of the Ottoman Empire was significantly different from all European belligerents. And this is also true for the scale of the war. In relative terms, when you look at the percentage of war casualties as a percentage of the population, the number is very high. Actually, the Ottoman Empire had the highest percentage of war casualties after Serbia as a percentage of the population. And that is due mostly to disease, not to war casualties on the battlefield. But in absolute terms, the campaigns fought by the Ottoman army were of a different order of magnitude from those fought on the Western Front. The only campaign that came close was that of Gallipoli, but even that was 3 times smaller than the Somme campaign in the summer of 1916. And in terms of numbers of soldiers, when we look at the Third Battle of Gaza, which is the decisive battle in Palestine, southern Palestine, in 1917, there the Ottoman army has less than 35,000 soldiers actually at the front. In that same year, 1917, the French general Nivelle put 1.2 million French troops into the field for his Nivelle offensive, which turns into a huge disaster, but 30 times as many. Then let's look at the population. Generally speaking, the Swedes are very quiet people. What's happening here? It's that, that that worked. So the policies of the Ottoman government towards its own citizens also distinguish it from its European counterparts. All belligerent countries took measures against communities and individuals whose loyalty was doubted. There were internment camps and prisons for enemy aliens, even if they'd lived in the country for generations, and for conscientious objectors, for instance. Deportations from the battle zones also took place, most notably those of the Jews of Galicia by the Russian army after the Russian occupation of August 1914. But the Ottoman policies were on a different scale altogether. In no other belligerent country was the war employed to fundamentally re-engineer the demographic makeup of the country. The Balkan War defeat and the subsequent forced removal of a large part of the Muslim population from the Balkans had convinced the Young Turk leadership in Istanbul that Anatolia now was the Turks' last stand, and that it needed to be secured at all cost. Even before the outbreak of the war, in May and June 1914, the Young Turks organized a campaign to expel about 160,000 Greek Orthodox but Ottoman citizens from Thrace and from the western shores of Anatolia. That campaign was partly inspired by fear that the war with Greece might commence again, and that the west coast was a vulnerable area. Successive Young Turk delegations had toured the area, Western Anatolia, in previous years and had already pointed out that the Greek Orthodox communities there had a dominant position in the economy and were potential threats. They were accused in the press of disloyalty and qualified as, and this is a quote, a tumor that needed to be removed from the body. When that removal actually took place in June 1914, refugees from the Balkans who had been brought to the area by the government played a role in the violence. When the Greek Orthodox had been forced to flee, their properties were given over to the refugees. In 1914, the hands of the government were still tied in the East because in February 1914, it had been forced by European powers under a great deal of pressure from Russia to agree to a far-reaching program of reform in the so-called Armenian provinces, which were intended to improve law and order in the area, and particularly to solve the conflicts over Armenian-owned land that had been seized by Kurdish tribes, was a big issue at the time. In August, after war breaks out, the government suspended that program. And when war actually broke out, when the Ottomans also joined the war in October, it was fully repudiated. What happened next was a combination of planning and event-driven improvisation. Young Turk leaders such as Talat had clear ideas about the way Anatolia should be restructured in demographic terms. From the nationalist agitation in the Balkans by the Bulgarians, the Serbs and the Greeks, they had learned the importance of statistics, and as a Minister of Interior, which was what he was at the time, Talat gave instructions that Armenians should be relocated in such a way that they would nowhere constitute more than 5% of the local population. After the defeat against the Russians in December 1914 on the Eastern Front, and especially when the British and the French attacked the Dardanelles, Gallipoli, from March 1915 onwards, The Young Turks started a program of deportations of Armenians into the Syrian desert, first from the areas close to the Eastern Front and then from all of Anatolia. These deportations were accompanied by mass executions of adult Armenian males and ultimately may have cost some 800,000 civilians their lives. Nobody knows or can know exactly how many. There is, of course, an abundant literature on many aspects of the Armenian genocide. It's a very contested area. But for the purposes of this paper, the comparison, the important thing to note is that as a result of these demographic policies of the Young Turks, Anatolia was turned into a solidly Muslim land with a completely different ethnic makeup than it had had only a few years earlier. And this laid the basis for the Turkish nation state that was to emerge later after the war. The process through which a state starts to see a sizable part of its own citizens as enemies or even enemy aliens, and then uses its powers to destroy them, is not mirrored in any of the other belligerent countries during World War I, although one has to remember that the colonial powers had used similar means on their subject populations in the colonies before World War I. Now, the end of the war, of course, is encapsulated in the peace treaties. And all post-war World War I peace treaties left a traumatic imprint on the defeated countries that were affected. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles, right from the start, was understood as a diktat, a dictated peace, which was accurate enough. It's a term that has been much used and abused by German nationalists and later Nazis, but essentially they were right. It was a dictated arrangement imposed on a defeated Germany without any serious negotiation between victors and losers. The Sèvres Treaty that ends the war with the Ottoman Empire fits into this series of imposed treaties that were concluded in Paris. The Sèvres Treaty also resembled the other products of the Paris Peace Conference in that it was a vengeful treaty. The treaties were not just attempts to bring about lasting peace in the post-war world, they were also instruments of retaliation and retribution. And the most famous instance of this, of course, is the war guilt clause included in the Versailles Treaty and the enormous war indemnities imposed on the Germans. But the proceedings of the London and San Remo conferences of 1920, as well as the memoirs of the participants, very clearly show that punishing the Turk, as it was called, was also a consideration in the case of the Sèvres Treaty. It can be questioned to what extent the post-war treaties really adhered to the ideal of self-determination, the self-determination of nations that had been enshrined in President Wilson's 14 points and in the Charter of the League of Nations, and that supposedly underlay all these new treaties. Clearly blocking the preference of the Austrians for unification with Germany, which was expressed in a perfectly legitimate referendum, was in direct contravention with this principle. Decisions on national borders tended to favor the claims of the former subject peoples in every case, whether you look at the Poles, the Slovaks, the Romanians, or the Serbs. And this is also true for the Ottoman Empire. The awarding to Greek administration of the whole area between Skalanova, Skušadaš in the south, to Kemer on the Gulf of Edremit in the north, so the substantial part of the west coast, including the city of Izmir, that rested on the recognition of the Greek claim that in this whole area, Greek Orthodox had formed the majority before the war and before the expulsions of 1914. And that is also true for the handover of European Turkey, Thrace, to Greece. Historical statistics indicate that this claim was exaggerated and that Greek Orthodox formed a majority or a plurality only in parts of the Sancak, the district of Izmir, in places like Ayvalık, Foça, and in the Çeşme Peninsula, and in some coastal areas of Thrace, but not in the hinterland. Both the British High Commissioner in Istanbul, de Robeck, and Foreign Minister Curzon recognized this. They recognized that the decisions on Thrace and on Izmir and on Western Anatolia contravened the principles of self-determination. In the East, the treaty established an independent Armenia, but left the establishment of the exact borders between the Ottoman Empire and Armenia to the mediation of President Wilson. Essentially, the size of the new Armenia, which was to include large parts of the provinces of Trabzon, Erzurum, Bitlis, Van, was based on claims of pre-war Armenian majorities there. But it is clear, again, from historical population statistics, that even before the deportations and the murders, the mass killings of Armenians in 1915, they had formed a majority only in very few areas in the East. So, inasmuch as these new borders of the Ottoman Empire were legitimized on the basis of self-determination, they were very questionable. However, in that respect, they were not fundamentally different from, say, the new Polish borders or the new Czech borders or the Hungarian borders. So to sum up, all of these three treaties were unilaterally imposed. They were vengeful. They were instruments of revenge. The borders they drew were unjust. What then makes the Sèvres Treaty different? Well, what makes it different is its semi-colonial character. The treaty not only took away large territories from the empire and limited its future armed forces, that is similar to Europe, but it also placed what remained of the empire under tutelage. After much debate, the Allies had decided to leave Constantinople, Istanbul, and the Straits, Bosporus and Dardanelles, in Ottoman hands. But Ottoman authority was severely impaired. The Straits were fully demilitarized and placed under an international commission with full authority over anything to do with shipping through the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. And this is interesting. On this commission, Britain, France, Italy, Russia, the United States, and Japan were represented by a commissioner who had 2 votes each. Greece and Romania had a commissioner with 1 vote. The Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, the defeated states, would ultimately have 1 vote each on the committee if and when they would have been admitted to the League of Nations. And so even in the end, while the Sultan and his government would remain in Istanbul, the actual say of the Turks, of the Ottomans in their own matters would be very, very limited indeed. The Allies also reserved the right to take away Istanbul from the Ottomans if they misbehaved. If they did not faithfully execute the treaty under Article 36, the Allies reserved the right to remove the Sultan from Istanbul. Then there were the exclusive rights of economic exploitation of the economic resources in the Ottoman Empire, in Anatolia, that were granted to Italy and to France. Huge parts of the southwest were given to Italy as an economic exploitation zone, and the whole south to France as an economic zone. And these articles are not part of the Sèvres Treaty. They are part of a separate agreement that France, Britain, and Italy signed on the same day that they signed the Sèvres Treaty, but kept secret at the time for fear that the Ottomans might otherwise refuse to sign the treaty. It was made public 3 months later. The capitulations were explicitly restored. All these preferential rights of foreigners in the empire, and they would in due course be replaced with a judicial regime drawn up by European legal experts. So all of these articles combined meant that the Ottoman Empire would not only be very small, it would also be under European control. It would revert to semi-colonial status. And finally, and not unimportantly, the treaty also endeavored to undo the effects of the demographic engineering during the war. Not only did it stipulate protection for the minorities, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, the Ottoman government also had to promise resettlement of all those who had been removed since the 1st of January 1914, and full restitution of all possessions that had been taken over from Greeks and Armenians who had been deported or had left. These possessions also had to be restored to the condition they had been in before they were abandoned. So while the treaty is in many ways an instrument similar to the other Paris treaties, it is also, in some respects, a much harsher document. Finally then, the aftermath. I think the fifth aspect of the Ottoman War experience that differs drastically from the European experience concerns the war, the aftermath of the war. And the effects of enormous loss of human life, economic dislocation, inflation, hunger, and loss of morale also, that was felt in Germany, in Austria, in Hungary, and in Russia in 1917, 1918, is also very much in evidence in the Ottoman Empire. By 1918, the empire's capacity to wage war was ending fast. However, the popular reaction was very different from that of other countries in Europe. Strikes and mutinies played a key role in forcing the other European states out of the war, as well as in the downfall of the monarchist regimes. In February 1917, in Russia, but also in January 1918 in Germany and in Austria and in Hungary, and again, of course, in October 1918 in Germany, factory workers staged mass protests and went on strike in the midst of war. These strikes played an important part in the collapse of the imperial regimes and in undermining the war effort. Over 1 million workers took part in the German strike of January 1918. And in Austria and Hungary, participation was also enormous, with some 700,000 workers striking in places like Vienna and Budapest. In the Ottoman Empire, however, with its low industrialization and very small industrial workforce, nothing along these lines happened. Organized industrial workers in the major urban centers, capable of taking collective action, were a key factor in enforcing regime change in Russia, in Germany, in Austria. It was completely absent in the Ottoman Empire. Same is true when we look at a very special case of strike, which is akin to industrial strikes, but different. Mutinies. Mutinies seem to have become widespread on the Russian front, in the Russian army, during the winter of 1916-17, after the Brusilov offensive. In February and March, a mutiny spread through the Petersburg garrison, men shooting their officers, and the failed Kerensky offensive, the only big offensive of the Russian Republic in 1917, encouraged further mutiny. In September 1917, the French suppressed a large mutiny by Russian division on the army base of La Courtine behind the Western Front in France. And in February 1918, a mutiny affecting the crews of 40 ships, many of them big ones, of the Austrian Navy in Cattaro, caused a panic in Vienna. The mutiny of the German Navy in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven in October 1918 triggered a widespread unrest that brought down the imperial regime in Germany. Within days, German sailors had joined forces with striking workers in places as far apart as Cologne, Hanover, and Berlin. So mutinies and strikes merged into one huge social movement. In the Ottoman army, there were no mutinies. None. Although conditions under which the Ottoman soldier had to fight were probably the most atrocious of all. Certainly in terms of provisioning, Ottoman soldiers did not resist in the form of mutinies, but in the form of desertion. At the end of the war, the Ottoman army had 4 deserters for every single soldier still in the front line, a proportion far higher than even the Russian army had had. Desertion became an enormous problem, forcing the Ottoman government to increase its rural gendarmerie force 8-fold during the war. That's an 800% increase in the numbers of gendarmes. They are needed to fight these bands of armed deserters who are roaming the countryside everywhere. When the end came, the social unrest and agitation in Russia and Germany and Austria and Hungary led to a radical regime change. The monarchies fell, and political power was taken over by well-established political organizations of the left. In Germany, the majority Social Democrats, together with the more radical independent Social Democrats, dominated the post-war interim government until December 1918, and the moderates majority Social Democrats of Ebert emerged as the most powerful force in the country in the 1919 elections. They got 38% of the vote. In German Austria, Social Democrat Karl Renner was elected the first Republican government leader. While in Hungary, the liberal Károly governed with Social Democrats and Communists. The provisional government of Russia in Petersburg was dominated by liberals, the Cadets, and increasingly by different wings of the Socialist Party. It shared power with the Bolsheviks. So, in other words, in each of these cases, experienced socialist or social democrat mass movements with a developed program and an established leadership, cadre structure, was immediately available as an alternative to the monarchy and to the militarized regimes of the war years. In each case, there were close links between these movements and the trade unions. All of this was not the case in the Ottoman Empire. The empire's most important socialist movements had been Jewish, Bulgarian, Greek, and Armenian, and their presence had been ended either by the Balkan War or by World War I. The Ottoman Muslim socialist movement was extremely weak. It had no mass following. Fundamentally, of course, the weakness of socialist and social democrat currents in the Ottoman Empire is directly linked to the lack of industrialization. The so-called Ottoman liberals were not in any position to take over power either. The Entente Libérale, the Hürriyet ve İtilaf, was an amalgam of individuals and groups who shared little but their hatred for the Young Turks who had been in power during the war. They had not been active politically in the country since 1912. After a period of transition, these liberals did come to power in Istanbul in March 1919, but they depended on the support of the palace and of the British, and they never had any say outside the capital. And inside that capital, from March 1920 onwards, they operated under formal British occupation. So they were not a serious force in the country. In the absence of political alternatives, the power in the country at large, outside the capital, remained in the hands of the ruling coalition that had run the country during the war. Young Turk party bosses and army officers, allied to Muslim trading interests in the provincial centers of Anatolia, who had profited from the transfer of Greek and Armenian property. The backbone of the nationalist resistance movement in Anatolia that starts in 1919 and that resists the Sèvres Treaty was formed by the remains of the Imperial Ottoman Army, led by Imperial Ottoman Young Turk officers. In other words, unlike the other defeated empires, the Ottoman Empire did not undergo a regime change. Even if the top names of the Young Turk regime of the war years, people like Enver, Talat, and Cemal, were no longer there. They had fled the country. And even though this regime changed into a republican regime in 1923, even during the first decades of that republic, after 1923, people, very often with a military background, who had been part of the ruling elite during the war years, during 1913, 1918, continued to run the country. And one reason that it was able to do so was that this elite did not have to shoulder the blame for defeat. That blame was put on the Young Turk leaders, the ones that had fled the country, that had been in charge in 1914 and had led the country into the war, or onto the very enemies of the Young Turks, the Sultan's liberal government in Istanbul, which had signed the Sèvres Treaty in 1920. And the ones had led the country into the disaster of the war, the other ones had signed this disastrous peace treaty. But it was others who had done it. And so those officers and administrators who take charge and who run the republic after 1923 do not have to shoulder that responsibility. They are not the losers of 1918. They are the victors of 1923. So as we know, alone among the defeated countries of World War I, the Young Turks, led by Mustafa Kemal Pasha, the later Ataturk, managed to undo the post-war settlement imposed by the Entente, and they did so by taking up arms again. In 1914, the outbreak of war had not meant a sharp division between the end of an era and the beginning of a new one in the Ottoman Empire, unlike in Europe. In the same way, the armistice did not mean the end of war, as it did in Europe. War continued in Anatolia for another 4 years, and by the time it ended, the victory in this national struggle had erased the memory of defeat. The generals that ruled the early republic, like I said, were not the losers of 1918. They were the winners of 1922-23. So, like the outbreak of war, like the war itself, the aftermath of war had a very different meaning for the people in the Ottoman Empire when compared to the other belligerent and particularly the other defeated countries of continental Europe. The Ottoman War, I would say, was indeed decidedly different from the experience of European countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very stimulating, edifying presentation. I'm guessing that there are lots of questions, but I will take the opportunity to start with one question. Um, it's rather well known, of course, common knowledge that the severity of the treaties, the peace treaties upon Germany, for example, played a role in what was later to come, of course, in Germany and World War II. For those of us who study Turkey, the notion of the Sèvres syndrome is familiar, but I don't think it's quite as familiar to a broader audience. But I'm wondering if you could say a few words about what the severity of the treaty, the fear that it arguably impressed upon the leaders and populations in the Ottoman Empire of being parted, and what it tells us about later policies regarding minorities in Turkey, the early republic, and so on.
Yes, the Sèvres syndrome it's a big issue in 20th century and even 21st century Turkish history. It's the idea that the Sèvres Treaty had almost put an end to Turkey's independent existence, and that something very similar could easily happen again. It's the fundamental insecurity about the stability of the state and particularly its external security, whether it is accepted, let's say, in the world of nations. This fundamental insecurity does not play a huge role in the early republic, which focuses squarely on the rebuilding, the new Turkish nation state is very forward-looking, but it rears its head again in the Cold War era, when, of course, the whole idea of national security, again, not only in Turkey, but throughout Europe, again becomes a dominant paradigm. The idea that there is a fundamental threat. So this old idea, this idea that Sèvres could easily have meant the end, and that if it had been up to foreigners, or to foreigners and internal minorities, then it in fact would have been the end. And that fear is, as it were, reignited in the Cold War era. And essentially every time there is a perceived security threat to Turkey. And we see the whole discourse on Sèvres, which centers on this combination of an external threat by big powers, supported by an internal threat of minorities. We see that very much from the late 70s, and then it's triggered by the Armenian claims, and the Armenian terror campaign of As-Salah, the Armenian Liberation Army, starts in 1975, and some 36 representatives of Turkey abroad are killed by Armenian terrorists over the next 10 years. And that is seen in these terms, and it's particularly after the coup d'etat of the Turkish army of September 1980 that this whole discourse on Sèvres, you could say this discourse of here we go again, is reawakened. And then it happens again in the 90s when the conflict with the Kurdish PKK really explodes. That starts in 84, of course, the campaign of the PKK, but it really reaches its apogee around mid-90s. Again, and there you have this combination of a perceived double threat, foreign powers that are out to somehow divide or diminish Turkey, supported by internal minorities, fifth columns that are instruments in the hands of these foreigners. So there's a succession of situations: Cold War, Armenian terror campaign, PKK guerrilla, that as it were serve as triggers for the Sèvres syndrome.
So there's a lasting legacy of this. I saw some hands here. Murat Somer.
One reason I really respect your work and benefit from your work is I think as a historian in reading Ottoman history and also early Republican history, the way I read it, the way I see it, you have a different way of looking at the relationship between nationalism and security, nationalism and conflict. I think a lot of works, they start with nationalism, ideology of nationalism, and go to political decisions and conflict. But in your case, without disregarding obviously the role of nationalist ideology, I think the relationship is at the same time perhaps more from conflict to nationalism. And in your, so is this a fair assessment? And in your talk, you mentioned two issues. One was the Armenian issue, that you said that before the end of, before the beginning of the war, there were some reform attempts by the government to resolve the conflict between the Armenian properties confiscated by Kurdish tribes mostly. Do you think that these reforms were seriously intended to deliver some results? And the second, the more important question is, Paul asked about perhaps non-Muslim minorities issue, this threat perception in the Turkish consciousness of non-Muslim minorities. But in early Republican periods, for example, the Republican policies vis-a-vis Muslim minorities, with respect to Kurds, for example. How do you see the relationship between conflict, change of borders, territorial changes, and the Republican policies toward the Kurds?
In the interest of, for the rest of the audience, I'm going to briefly, is it okay, Murat, if we focus on the first two questions, since you have rather limited time, and then maybe we can continue discussion afterwards. The first one, an appreciation and would it, of your work, and would it be a correct broad assessment to say that you sort of turn the causal direction of, whereas most nationalism scholars look at nationalism as having an impact on conflict, you also turn it around and looked at the reverse direction of causality. And the second question, you mentioned some pre-war property reforms regarding Armenians. Were they seriously intended?
Sorry, the second again?
The second question regarding the pre-war land property reforms, were they serious?
Well, I think that's a fair assessment, yes. And the reason is that I think that structurally we historians tend to overestimate the role of intellectuals. When you read histories in which nationalism is, as an ideology, is seen as the moving factor, and really something that triggers conflict and war. The implication is that those people who are, promoting nationalist ideology, writers, publicists, journalists, and so on, that they actually determine the course of events. And I very much doubt it. I think that when we try to analyze the period, we do much better to look at people who are actually in a position of power, to look at the military leaders, the political leaders, rather than place too much emphasis on the thinkers, the publicists, the ideologues. And I think it is, to put it in a nutshell, I think that the course of event is influenced by Talat Pasha rather more than by Ahmet Ağoğlu. It's not, but I think it's a problem. We tend to overemphasize the role of intellectual currents, not just nationalism, but intellectual currents, I think, because for two very obvious reasons. One, they write, and these intellectuals write, which is ideal for a historian. You can read them. Finding the getting at the actual thinking of military leaders, generals or politicians is a lot more difficult. And the second reason, of course, is they're like us. It's very tempting for academics to assume that intellectuals actually change the course of history. That gives us all hope. About the Armenian reforms, well, up to a point. Until the summer of 1914, the Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress, is ready to talk, and is actually talking to the Armenian Dashnat Sutun, the Armenian nationalist and social democrat organizations. So that door is still open then, but it is conditional, and what they want in exchange from the Armenians is a promise not to involve foreign powers, not to internationalize the conflict. And the Armenians are not ready to give that assurance. That's a very crucial point. These Young Turks, they're from Macedonia. They've all lived through the events in Macedonia, where there's a huge insurrection in 1903. And then Russia and Austria together impose a regime of reforms in Macedonia under foreign tutelage. And the Russians in 1914 managed to force through a similar arrangement for Eastern Anatolia. Actually, a reform program is agreed on, and two governorships are created, one in the north and one in the south, huge areas under foreign governors. A Norwegian and a Dutchman are actually appointed as governors general of Eastern Anatolia. And they actually go to Turkey in 1914. And so for the Young Turks, that is a very frightening perspective. That scenario, it seems like the Macedonian scenario is repeating itself in Eastern Anatolia. And of course, they lost Macedonia in the Balkan War, so they fear they may lose Eastern Anatolia this time. The answer, therefore, is up to a point. They were ready to talk to the Armenians if the Armenians were ready to restrict it to an internal discussion without involving European powers.
The deficiencies that were clear in your presentation regarding industrial output, railroads, capacities, and so on, did this result in, or can we see Ataturk's reform process and the modernization process of the early republic as a response to the
No, I don't think so. In the 1920s, the policies of the Kemalists, of Ataturk, and his group are very much geared towards, nationalizing the economy, the existing economy, buying out foreign railway concessions, for instance, port concessions. But there is not yet an industrialization policy. The industrialization policy comes in the early 30s and is a response to the world crisis, not to what happened in World War I. The policies of the 1920s are modernist in the sense that they try to impose a new legal framework derived from Europe, but also new cultural codes, dress codes, etc.
I meant actually modernization in a general sense.
Yeah.
Not just the kind of technical
Industrial.
sense.
Yeah. No. Well.
The alphabet and the kind of
Yeah.
movement towards Western culture in many ways.
Well, there is a continuity there. I mean, the discussion about changing the alphabet predates World War I. It's already discussed among the Young Turks, in the early years of the century, and that's also true for things like the dress reform and so on. These ideas they are all circulating about the major aspects of modernization. They're already demonstrably circulating in circles of these young Turks. It's what happens is that with the new regime, with Mustafa Kemal coming to power, it is pressed decisively, as it were. And so it is not so much, I would say, a reaction to the events of World War I, but it is a decisive it is the decision to act on these projects that had been there all around, but which had lacked the actual lacked, as it were, the energy and the power, but also, of course, the circumstances to carry them out. It is to a certain extent, of course. 1923 is the first moment in a decade that there's actually peace, and that some of the energies can go somewhere else.
I'm wondering if I could just perhaps take the occasion also to ask you to reflect briefly on the benefits of a comparative approach. In historiography, and as area studies scholars, I think there's a tendency, and there has been a tendency, perhaps, to immerse ourselves in our own cases and our own countries and regions and view them as sui generis. But you clearly took a comparative approach to this question. What are the benefits and challenges of doing so, would you say?
Well, I think, it helps you if you try to answer questions like, why do we not see the kind of regime change at the end of the war that we see in other defeated countries? But also when you look at the war effort itself, I mean, it really brings it home. I mean, you can talk in the abstract about the Ottoman army fighting under very difficult circumstances. The moment you know that they that the Brits, produce as much coal in a day as they produce in more than a year, it brings it home, what was actually happening there. And it helps you to understand why the Ottomans had to cut down the olive groves of Syria to feed their railway engines. So one of the economic disasters of the Syrian lands is that the olive groves largely disappear into the railway engines moving trains to the front, and olives don't grow that fast, so that's really something that affects the area very, very severely. So once you know about the comparison, I think you can better understand the phenomenon.
Okay. Well, I think we're actually out of time, and it looks like there's a class outside waiting to come in. But I would like to thank you again for a wonderful presentation, and I hope this is the first of many visits to Stockholm University. Thank you.